most freedom in Sabbath.
You cannot go on stage and you forget the words to War Pigs.
We just got stoned all the time, just crazy.
It just had to come to an end, and we needed to sort of get away from each other.
Black Sabbath, 4 young men from Aston in Birmingham, who would by and large create and define a sound that would soon be known as heavy metal. Black Sabbath took the core of 60s blues rock and turned it on its head with bludgeoning rhythms, menacing riffs, and dark, eerie lyrics.
It's so difficult to actually try and quantify heavy metal or qualitatively analyse heavy metal. When did it start? Who began the whole thing? It's become such a figure of debate over the last 40 years as to the genesis and birth of the whole movement and environment and how far you can trace it back. But to me, Black Sabbath are the first true heavy metal band.
Well, you know, if you say that to Ozzy, he gets very upset because he hates the term heavy metal. I'm not sure the rest of the band particularly enamoured by the words heavy metal, but I suppose it's a band that it's definitely that terminology is affixed to.
I don't think there would be bands like Slayer or Metallica or all the other metal bands out there. They were like this branch that just spawned all these other bands later. Songs like Children of the Grave, you know, and the riffs that Tony came up with, you know, and that inspired that whole guitar chunking revolution, you know, that followed later.
If you think of Metallica and Slayer and the bands that came later, they were much harder edged, more brutally even than Black Sabbath. But as a concept of heavy, dark music, certainly Black Sabbath were the very first in the field, really.
I think in their own way they were kind of a precursor to punk rock because they were so raw, and their attitude, they didn't give a monkeys, you know. And I think that's the appeal with them, really.
They found something new. They found a new direction. A lot of people were quite scared of what they were doing at the time. It was not pleasant. You know, it wasn't quite right. There was something evil going on here. In actual fact, they're really nice guys.
Guitarist Tony Iommi, drummer Bill Ward, singer John Ozzy Osbourne, and bassist Terence Geezer Butler would become not just one of the most pioneering groups of its day, but also one of the most influential.
Just when you put these 4 guys together, they came up with there was just a really special combination there, you know.
They were mates. They were mates who kind of grew up in a very working class area of Birmingham, Aston, Birmingham.
There was no grand master plan with Sabbath. They just started playing the stuff that they enjoyed playing, and you know, they happened to decide to go in a fairly doomy direction.
They were unrelenting musicians. They were the first to just kind of say, well, here's a great riff, we're going to plow it into your head, you know, at a slow volume, so you're going to feel every driving, you know, every powerful, painful moment of it.
They had an attitude before anybody knew what an attitude was. You know, they played in a certain way that fitted totally with the name and the overall atmosphere.
I don't know if there was anyone doing that sort of music. It just wasn't anything close to, you know, putting horror movies and heavy music together. No one was doing it.
Well, we just thought that tried to put music over in a different angle. You know, it's sort of like this evil sound, you know, this heavy, doomy sound. You know.
The way I would do it was we'd jam about with a riff, come up with some kind of, I'd come up with a riff, and I'd sort of sing a type of a melody to it, and then Hughes would write the words. But it was fine to work with. I mean, as all people are in bands, you always get the, you know, jokers and stuff, and as it was like sort of the joke, you know, while we were putting stuff together, he'd be outside playing football, you know, or walking around the block or something, you know.
Black Sabbath, like all the great bands from that era, the late 60s to the mid-70s, built their audience on the road. They weren't about getting big record deals and going straight into the studio to record multi-tracked albums. They had to learn the hard way. There was no easy route for Black Sabbath. They went out and toured everywhere. They played every hellhole they could find.
They found it very difficult to get people's attention. So gradually the blues tunes were wound up, racked up, played louder and more powerfully, so that the guitar riffs grew more and more menacing, simply as a way of really distracting the noise of people talking in the background. It's like a musician's attack on the audience. Right, if you don't listen to us, we'll play as loud as humanly possible.
The constant touring soon attracted the attention of record companies, and before long, they signed to Philips Records. Their debut single, Evil Woman, was released in January 1970, with the self-titled debut album released on Friday the 13th the following month. It reached the UK top 10. For an album recorded in just 2 days, Black Sabbath was an astonishingly powerful debut. The style of music was unlike anything heard before, as perfectly illustrated with the title track that would ultimately define a whole new genre.
What is this that stands before me? Feather in black, which points at me.
6 minutes 37 seconds, starts off with rain, bells, thunder, Black Sabbath, by Black Sabbath, from Black Sabbath, and it should be on the Black Sabbath label. I mean, there's not many bands that can do that. You know, your title song is the same as your band, the same as your album title. It's magic, mate, magic.
The song Black Sabbath takes one idea, really, which is to play the root, the octave of the same note, and then the flattened fifth, which is always deemed to be the devil's interval, which you also hear in the Planet Suite in Mars. Down, down, down. It's very similar to down, down, down. It's obviously been around for centuries, but to use it in a rock song is very unusual.
I think if it was released now, people would probably overlook it because it's got a long intro and it's not a two-minute single. In those days, you could get away with, you know, Pink Floyd 2.5-minute intros to a song before the song even gets started. I think Sabbath get away with it because of that and because it's a classic song. But if it came around now, I don't think it would work, you know.
But the great thing about that first song is it's self-centered and self-contained. Self-centered in the way that everything is maneuvered and manipulated within that song towards a crescendo which happens in the middle and then opens up and out towards the end. and self-contained, because it really is the whole of heavy metal, almost the whole of Ozzy era Black Sabbath in one song. It can drive forward in a thrashy way, it can lay back in a very doomy way. You want doom, you want thrash, you want death metal, it's all there.
Well, the first album was actually recorded on a 4-track machine in a basement in London's Denmark Street, and Tony Iommi remembers that once he'd done the riff for Black Sabbath, the actual piece, kind of set the standard for the rest of the album and really set the standard for Black Sabbath's whole career.
But what really kicked it in, I always believe, is the fact that it had a very basic, raw attitude. Wasn't overproduced, which was the case with so much at the time, and things are moving on. The golden era, as it were, of the hippie movement, the Summer of Love and so forth, were changing. This is almost the antithesis.
There was an energy there. There's a beauty in the mistakes, and there was just a real raw energy in those early Sabbath records that, you know, even bands spending millions of dollars today in studios can't reproduce.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Success in America followed soon after. The album reached the US top 40 in August, remaining in the charts over a year and selling in excess of 1 million copies. Sabbath wasted no time in producing a follow-up album, released in September 1970. In advance of its release, the title track was put out as a single and surprised everyone when it became a hit.
From what I understand, Paranoid was the happiest accident in metal history. Something that began as a jam or a filler for their second record.
We all went in to record the album, and in the lunch break, I didn't go out to eat with the others, I just stayed at the studio and just came up with this riff, this Paranoid.
They come back in, he's playing the riff, and basically Geezer picks up bass, Bill's on drums, and it's all done and dusted within 30 minutes.
It's difficult to actually know what a straw poll of Sabbath fans will bring out as the #1 song of all time, but I do know if you polled across the board in rock fans, not necessarily Sabbath aficionados, Paranoid will be the #1 Sabbath song. It's so identifiable, it's them.
In Ozzy's voice, especially on a track like Paranoid, there's a desperation that can't come from a fictional place. He means every word of Paranoid. Even though he didn't write all those words, or may not have written all those words, you know, the disorientation, the disillusionment, and possibly the dissatisfaction with life that the character in that song is suffering, it can't be faked.
It's just one of those great riffs, isn't it? It's Motorhead, it's Smoke on the Water. You know, Paranoid is just, it's so ridiculous, but brilliant. I love it. But whether it would have had the impact without the rest of the album, I don't know if you could look at it as a piece on its own. It would probably have been just an oddity.
In addition to the single, the album also featured the classics Iron Man and War Pigs that would prove to be amongst the most popular and enduring songs of their career.
Generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses. In the field the bodies burning, as the war churning.
We were in the studio to write an album, the Paranoid album, which was going to be originally called War Pigs, but that's why the cover was with a chap with a sword and a shield. But they banned it from being called War Pigs, so we called it Paranoid, which had nothing to do with the cover at all.
Paranoid as an album was a better construction, I believe, than the first one. It has some fascinating songs on there. Electric Funeral, which is incredibly doomy. Fairies Wear Boots. Rat Salad's another fantastic song. War Pigs, what can one say about War Pigs?
Something about that air raid siren connotes doom in so many people's minds. It's always, you hear that siren, you want to run for the shelters, you want to get out of the way of the blitzkrieg, you want to save yourself, your prized possessions, your family, and that's what they start their record with, something evil and something to make you cower in fear right off the bat.
And this is it. This is a band who aren't singing about, oh, I'm buying my girlfriend a box of chocolates, and I'm going to shag her on a Saturday night. This is a band singing about the rights and wrongs of what's going on planet Earth. For a second album, boys, you cracked it. You've done it, You've delivered the goods.
Thank you very much.
The rise in the band's popularity meant increased demand for concert appearances throughout Europe. A planned date at the Royal Albert Hall at the start of their 1971 tour fell through because the Hall's management banned the group, fearing their fans would damage the venue.
Remember, this was an era when teeny bop was starting to happen and the 70s was starting to open out, glam was about to come in, image was everything. It was about being glamorous, really, and having that sort of presentation. And suddenly you had this unwashed lot who looked like they didn't belong anywhere, coming in and getting very close to a #1 hit single in the UK.
A great part of Sabbath's appeal is that when you go and see them, it would be hugely loud and hugely heavy and, very appealing in a sense that can it possibly be more awesome and heavy than this?
In those days, it was quite shocking. Lyrically, and just the name Black Sabbath was quite provocative to some people.
But of course it got built up in the national press. People were afraid of their young children being sent off to see a band that was associated with that kind of devilry, and you'd be able to ring up a church and ask a vicar what he thought of Black Sabbath, and you get a fairly predictable reaction, so that would make a nice headline in the national newspapers. So, and then of course Tony Iommi had to spend a lot of time denying that they were seriously into black magic.
Oh yeah, we used to have all this bullshit down. There's fucking witches and freaks phoning us up asking us to play at black masses and all this crap. It was a bit heavy for about 12, 18 months, And then we sort of we came into America and we started to do a lot of work in America, and it sort of levelled out in England a lot,
I think Americans were probably very scared of Black Sabbath when they came over here, because it was the hippie era, love and peace, and then comes Sabbath, who are the opposite of that.
I remember seeing a newspaper clipping a friend of mine had here in Los Angeles when Sabbath came through town, I think in like 74 or 75, and it was like bold black text, on the front, Ozzy stampedes through town or some shit like that. It was like big news, Had everybody up in arms, like, oh fuck, the devil's coming to town.
In July 1971, the third album, Master of Reality, was another top 10 success both sides of the Atlantic. An even more accomplished recording than the previous two albums, it included the classic Children of the Grave.
Children of the Grave was very much about the fact that we had a new generation coming through who weren't prepared to accept the values and attitudes of their parents and were challenging things and standing up and saying to everybody, listen to them because they're making sense, and if you don't listen to them you're going to regret it.
Children of the Grave, again, usually one of the encore songs, you know, Paranoid Children, or get Children of the Grave, Paranoid, bang, they're off. These are statements, these are absolute statements the band's making.
Well, Master of Reality was the third album, and the third album is always the tricky one for any band, really. Especially after one as powerful as Paranoid, with things like War Pigs on it. And, although perhaps it didn't have quite so many memorable pieces on it, it was still a workmanlike album, I think.
But Massive Reality took a lot longer. That's when we started getting into long time for us. It was going into weeks, and we thought, oh God, this is taking a bit long. And we went to about 3 or 4 different studios because couldn't get the vibe in them days. I don't know how we got to that, but
I think by that point they really had started to get very proficient. The songs were there for the first 2 albums, but when Master of Reality hit, and you had songs like Sweet Leaf, Into the Void and Children of the Grave, there was more consistency about the way they were working in the studio. Masters of Reality had that feeling that he was a band maturing, growing, and prepared to try different things, albeit still very much rooted to what they knew worked.
In September 1972, the rather unimaginatively titled Volume 4 ironically proved to be the band's most imaginative album to date.
that was good for us at the time we'd done Butler and 4, because it was the first time I think we'd actually recorded in America, and we went over to LA, and it was great. It was a great time. It was a whole new thing to be recording in sort of a record plant, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. It was good.
A lot of people regard Volume 4 as being the best Black Sabbath album made by the original lineup. Iommi, Butler, Osbourne, Ward. I can understand why, because it's got a very strengthening consistency. A lot of the other albums have their peaks and then their troughs. It doesn't really happen that way on Volume 4. It's very consistent and across the board in the way that it works. It's got its standout moments, Cornucopia, Wheels of Confusion, Supernaut, Snowblind. They're 4 tremendous tracks, but the consistency throughout it is possibly at a higher level than it had been previously. And I think Sabbath kicked into a new feeling of believability and belief. They got to a point with Masters of Reality where I feel that possibly they were wondering where they were going to go next. Volume 4 opened up new horizons. Not that they suddenly came out with a new sound, but they realized they really had ways of developing what they already had.
Volume 4 was, in my book, the last great Black Sabbath album that they did as Black Sabbath with the original lineup.
For 1973's Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, the band brought in keyboard wizard Rick Wakeman for one track. Elsewhere, Iommi's own use of keyboards gave the album an untypical Sabbath sound. It was an album that divided opinion. Many fans claim it's the band's finest hour, but others felt that the band had strayed too far from the typical Sabbath sound.
Yeah, well, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was, again, I thought that was the best album to date then. It was a lot more involved, and we'd done stuff, we went a bit more adventurous by using sort of perhaps more acoustic sort of things, and a bit more musical, I thought, than the other albums up to that date.
It gave them that extra edge, and you hear it on the title track itself, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. and you hear it throughout the album. This is an album where Sabbath started to experiment a little more with sounds, but they didn't ever lose touch of what made it happen in the first place.
I think it's just natural experimentation as far as a musician's concerned, and especially a studio-orientated musician at that time who's coked out of his mind, is to bring different elements into their, you know, the music that they're making. And keyboards is probably the easiest route to go down without pissing off too many fans.
Sabbath returned to action in July 1975 with Sabotage, an album that was heavier than anything they had ever done. Critics of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath considered the new album a return to form.
Sabotage came at a period when Sabbath themselves were undergoing all kinds of pressures backstage behind the scenes. There were courtroom battles and arguments within the group and arguments with their management caused a lot of stress, and of course they're living a wild rock and roll lifestyle. The combination was not good for their health or sanity, I think.
And this is a band that have lost management, they've lost direction, they're on massive amounts of drugs. They've got money, but they haven't got as much money as they should have. But having said that, symptom of the universe.
Sabotage was the last of the great collection of albums which that lineup of the band recorded from the late 60s all the way through to the mid-70s, and it has some very fine standout moments on it.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of angst and pressure in a way produces good work. It made their music have even more power, more meaning and strength, so, despite all the tribulations.
By 1976, friction between members started to have an adverse effect on the band, particularly the relationship between Ozzy and Tony Iommi. These tensions showed in the next album, Technical Ecstasy. Whilst having its moments, it's noticeably weaker than the previous efforts.
Technical Ecstasy is a disappointment. It doesn't really sound like Sabbath knew what they wanted to do. They seemed to know what they didn't want to do. They wanted to move forward, but weren't quite sure how to do it. And there's nothing on that album that really makes you feel, this is quite astonishing, this is a great song, shame it got lost in the whole of the rest of the album.
Nah, cack. I'm sorry to say, cack. And I know there'll be a lot of Black Sabbath fans out there that are going to kick my ass for that, but, you know, I have high standards. We're talking about 4 albums that were released, absolute classics, and now it's just becoming bog standard, drugged up rock and roll cack.
Many members of the band thought it was very good. Ozzy actually said it was a very enjoyable album to make. At least Tony Iommi enjoyed it because he made it.
I must admit, I quite enjoyed it. I enjoyed that album, although I think I was a bit too self-indulgent for me. I think I got a bit too over the top with this, because I got more into the production side then, and I was fiddling about. But yeah, I think it was probably slightly apart from some of the other albums we've done.
Drug-related problems also clouded the band's fortunes, and by the summer of '77, Ozzy Osbourne left the band. The rest of the group called upon an old friend from Birmingham, Dave Walker, to work on the next album, but it didn't work out. And by the beginning of '78, Ozzy had rejoined as the band completed the Never Say Die album.
Never Say Die is the album that really and truly was the end of the band, and you can actually hear it in the way that the album is constructed. The title track itself is very good song, better than anything on Technical Ecstasy. And it could have easily been done for one of the earlier albums and would have worked, because it is a very strong song. The rest of the album is pretty much forgettable.
This is a band in their death throes. This is a band in their death throes. I'd never say die, I'd say die now and get on with it fast.
The Sabbath story is riddled with drink and drugs, there's no question about that. Ozzy was seen as the most out of control of all of them because Ozzy was the one who was up front, Ozzy the one doing interviews, and Ozzy was the one the stories were all about. However, the rest of them weren't exactly angelic, and it became a problem.
And it just wasn't working, things just wasn't happening. We ended up rehearsing for 11 months and nothing was coming up. So we'd come up with plenty of riffs and stuff, but there was no enthusiasm. So it just had to come to an end, and we had to have a talk, so it's not going to happen. And it was the time when Ozzy went then. I think at that time he was going through a lot of problems himself, and we needed to sort of get away from each other, and we needed to do our own thing, I think. Well, he certainly needed to do his own thing.
I think Ozzy took it really, really hard. You know, he holed himself up in a hotel in Los Angeles, the Park Hotel, basically just, you know, drinking cocaine and the odd pizza. And apparently there was some bastard in one of the apartments opposite who used to play Iron Man all the time, which must have driven him insane.
Ozzy's replacement was former Rainbow singer Ronnie James Dio.
I don't think there should have been a replacement for Ozzy. Obviously, in terms of them keeping the band going and making money, it was a good idea, and they sold a lot of records with Dio, but just wasn't Sabbath.
And I kind of see where Tony was going to with that decision. We want someone in that we can rely on, a professional who's got a great voice and is not going to let us down by getting pissed up, going out on stage and getting his arse out. And Ronnie Dio fitted all of those categories.
I mean, straight away it was like life into the band again by just bringing somebody new in, and the sparkle was there again, and it was really exciting. Everybody was like really ready to go again by hearing somebody put something into it, you know.
The strange thing is, somebody reminded me recently, the person who suggested Ronnie James Dio to Sabbath was Sharon Osbourne, or Sharon Arden as she was then. Now, whether she meant it as a joke, I don't know, but it worked.
It worked. It worked as a band, but to me that became a different band. You know, that the sound of his voice is so different.
You could also say that he was too good. You know, sometimes you can improve the life out of something. Now, I think for the time, sort of 79, 80, 81, Ronnie was the absolute perfect person to have in Black Sabbath.
Dio also brought along with him Rainbow's engineer and producer Martin Birch. Despite many believing Ozzy was irreplaceable, the resulting album, Heaven and Hell, was a superb return to form and a huge commercial success, spawning 2 chart singles, Neon Nights and Die Young.
It really was Black Rainbow, in terms of the very best of Black Sabbath, the very best of Ronnie James Dio era Rainbow, combined them, locked them together and made it identifiable as this band now called Black Sabbath. It had rollicking, rolling anthems like Die Young, Neon Nights. It had huge, sprawling epics like Heaven and Hell itself, Children of the Sea. It was a magnificent piece of music.
Some of the things we had already written before Ronnie came, so his involvement was good really, because he came up with a few other ideas to add to the songs. So Children of the Sea we changed around with Ronnie's involvement, and of course the way he'd sing is a totally different singer to Ozzy, so the way he'd approach things was a lot more operatic, if you like.
I think only a singer of his calibre could have carried it off. The fans did accept it eventually, and they did go to see the band. I mean, often Black Sabbath would have replacements later, which didn't work so well, but in this case, I think people were prepared to forgive and forget and listen, at least give them a try.
I remember going to see the Heaven and Hell tour at Hammersmith, and it was very professional. It was very, very professional. But I'm a great believer in a band with the original lineup is the only band that can exist. And although it was slick, it was professional, it sounded great, it looked great, it just wasn't even close.
Neonites was the opening track on Heaven and Hell. Now the opening track of any album, especially an album as crucial as this one, with the change in lineup that Sabbath had, is vital. It gets people into the album or it doesn't. And as soon as you heard the opening rollicking, galloping chords of Neonites, you knew Sabbath were on a winner.
Well, I was still pretty young. You know, it was cool at the time, with Heaven and Hell and all that stuff, you know, but when I listen to it now, it doesn't really hold water. Like, I can still listen to Sabbath with Ozzy in it and still just get goosebumps, you know, but the Dio stuff and everything that came after that, it just wasn't working for me. It just wasn't Ozzy, man. You know, if they were going to continue on, they should have renamed the band something else or something. Black Sabbath without Ozzy isn't Black Sabbath.
If that band had formed without it being Black Sabbath before, you know, if this was a new band that had been formed and those were the people in it, that could have been a fantastic band. But because they had the history, and the fans always compare what's gone before, and didn't work for me.
While touring to support the album, Bill Ward was forced to leave the band due to ill health. This lineup recorded the album Mob Rules in 1981.
Now, it was always going to be a problem to follow Heaven and Hell. Very few bands could have done so. And Mob Rules does suffer a little bit by comparison. It's a very good album, but it's not as good as Heaven and Hell. In a way, they made their great statement with Heaven and Hell. The Only Way was down after that. Although, having said that, Mob Rules itself, which was to feature in the animated movie Heavy Metal, which came out in the early 80s, plus Country Girls, Sign of the Southern Cross, these are very, very good songs.
I know that I think Tony's quite proud of that album, but again, it was like, I you know, maybe around at friends, or maybe even in the offices where I was doing the merchandising for them, you know, someone played it to me and it was like, yeah, okay.
Ronnie was great on that. Tony was great on that. But for me, it wasn't a classic. Didn't really play it that much. You know, some albums you get, you just never stop playing them. That wasn't one of them for me.
Clashes between Iommi and Dio meant that by the time the Live Evil album appeared, Dio had left Black Sabbath, taking a piece with him.
First live album they'd ever done. They recorded it, went into the studio to mix it, and everything went wrong. Main reason being, Ronnie Dio on one hand and Iommi and Butler on the other didn't trust each other. So you had a situation where Ronnie was convinced Iommi and Butler were going into the studio and turning down his vocals and turning up the bass and guitar in the mix. So what he started to do when they weren't around was go into the studio and turn up his vocals and turn down the bass and guitar. So you had this crazy situation where Ronnie would go in and instruct the engineer to do one thing, Iommi and Butler would go in at another time and instruct the engineer to do exactly the opposite. And this was confusion and confrontation going on. And it was clear there were major problems going on in the band. And it couldn't go on like that.
And the other thing that Ozzy did was he was doing an album called Speak of the Devil, which again I designed the cover for that, and which was to be the perfect Sabbath set, and record it and put it out in direct competition with Live Evil. And that's what they did. And I know which one I prefer.
Fans were happy with the news of Bill Ward's return as drummer, but were surprised when the recruitment of former Deep Purple lead singer Ian Gillan was announced.
They had a big press reception when they got together, and Ian already looked a bit uncomfortable and unsure of himself, even before he'd actually sung with the band. So it was a bit debatable whether he really was committed to Black Sabbath. And when he went on stage with the group, of course, he had the problem of remembering all the lyrics to the songs. So I think pasting word sheets and crib sheets on the stage wasn't particularly a good idea.
Unbeknownst to Gillan, is at the beginning of the show, they're going to pump dry ice out onto the stage, which comes up to about there. Thick, dry ice. It was magnificent. I was very close to that. I was looking at that. And you suddenly get Gillan coming out, and the song starts. He obviously knows the first line, and he's got it, and he's...
The resulting LP, Born Again, released in September 1983, was an incredibly heavy album. But the combination of Gillan's lyrics and vocals sat uncomfortably alongside Iommi's dark and ominous riffs.
Born Again has to be the worst album Black Sabbath ever did, including the cover. I mean, come on.
Look at this album sleeve. Look at this magnificent album sleeve. But this is an album sleeve that I didn't want to do. I was doing Ozzy album sleeves, right? And this was a political stance by Don Arden to get people that were working for Sharon into his camp. So I was asked to design this sleeve, and it's like, what's the worst idea? What's it called? Born Again. What's the worst idea?
Terrible record. Disturbing the Priest and Zero the Hero are okay, quite decent. The rest of it is a mess. It sounds like Ian Gillan and Black Sabbath not getting on. They didn't quite know what they wanted to do.
It was a bit unfair to bring Ian into Black Sabbath and expect him to, especially after being with such a name band as Purple for so many years and being sort of the main front character of Deep Purple, to bring him into Black Sabbath and expect him to sort of sing all Black Sabbath stuff to how we were used to it. It was a very difficult job, and particularly for somebody like him, say coming from Purple. And it just didn't quite work, sort of expecting him to do that.
Again, Bill Ward was unable to fulfill drum duties for the tour, and yet another Birmingham musician, Bev Bevan of ELO fame, stepped in. The tour tested the loyalties of Sabbath fans. Gillan struggled to remember the words of old Sabbath classics, and the inclusion of Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water was a bit too much for most Sabbath fans to take. Within a year, Gillan moved on to front the Deep Purple reunion, being replaced briefly by Dave Donato, who never actually recorded with the band. By now, Sabbath was a bit like a soap opera. Bill Ward returned, and Geezer left. Bill left again. Then, as a surprise to everyone, the original four got back together for the Live Aid concert on the 13th of July, 1985. But soon after it, all dissolved, and Sabbath was put on ice as Tony Iommi produced a solo album. The album, Seventh Star, released in January 1986, featured another former Deep Purple singer, Glenn Hughes.
I gave you my heart, you cried for my soul.
You know, Tony had written the music before I came in, and his idea was to have three singers. I think Rob Halford was one, and Dio, myself the third. But as soon as I got my teeth into the first three tracks over a period of 2 nights, I wrote the first 3 songs, and he was very happy. Very happy. And the album took 3 months to make. You know, there was a lot of partying going on. There was a lot of this and that, the other.
Glenn Hughes, probably one of the, at that time, greatest drug addicts walking the earth, along with Tony Iommi, again, probably one of the greatest drug addicts walking the earth, is a marriage made in disaster. It was a marriage made in hell. It's, how they even produce an album, I don't know.
And Seventh Star's a very good record. It's held up incredibly well. In for the Kill, which is a real rollicking, rousing rocker. You've got songs like No Stranger to Love, which is a wonderful power ballad, if you want to use that term. Danger Zone and Seventh Star itself, these are excellent songs, but they're not Black Sabbath songs. And then his record company's management say, Tony, look, You put this record out as Tony Iommi, you're not going to sell very many copies. We'll put you on tour, you're going to do clubs. You'll be lucky to fill them. But if we put this out as Black Sabbath, you'll sell a lot more records, you'll be doing arenas and theatres. How about it, Tony?
As it went on, time went on, Black Sabbath was still supposed to have owed Warner Brothers another album, so they nabbed that one to become a Black Sabbath album, which did upset the cart a bit, because everybody we got sort of panned quite a lot for that.
The idea of me fronting Sabbath in my darkest period, hiding behind vodka and drugs, wasn't very pretty, you know. You cannot go on stage in front of 20,000 boys and you forget the words to War Pigs. It's not really simple.
There was a great concern within the Sabbath camp, and I know because Tony Iommi told me when I interviewed him at the time for Kerrang. And I asked him about touring, and he said, yes, we are. Who's the vocalist? It'll be Glenn. You happy with that? I mean, sure, Glenn can get through a tour. Has got a reputation for not being able to do it. Don't know if he can. I'm concerned about it. I really don't know if Glenn can get through this tour. That's what Tony said, and we will have someone standing by just in case. Only just in case. We still want to give Glenn the shot, but you could tell there was no confidence in the Sabbath camp that Glenn Hughes would make the tour happen. That preyed on Glenn's mind because he knew they didn't have the confidence. It undermined him, and just a few dates into the tour, suddenly Glenn was off it and Ray Gillan was in.
By now, Black Sabbath was to all intents and purposes Tony Iommi's solo project with an ever-changing array of musicians. The Eternal Idol album of 1987 included singer Tony Martin and another ex-Rainbow Man in bassist Bob Daisley.
There's a man who sees all with the sea and what the future holds for all. As the days grow dark with his soul and final warning.
Well, after all the departures from the ranks of lead singer with Black Sabbath, they had to cast around and find somebody else, and the man who drew the short straw, I suppose, was Tony Martin, who came into the band and did a good job, but he wasn't a terribly charismatic performer.
He could certainly cover all the different eras of Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, Ronnie Dio, Ian Gillan even, you know. But, of course, that kind of meant that his overall ability took away from his individuality.
A singer. That was it. There wasn't any spark or kind of charisma. He was just a great singer. But again, wrong for Sabbath.
And if Tony Martin is watching this, no disrespect, sir, you're a great vocalist. It's just that when you remember to a May night in 1970 where these four guys come out on stage and produce something so much magical energy and give a performance that, you know, in a 15, 16-year-old's head, it's like, oh my God, I've seen the future. I know now which path I must walk down. You know, to seeing what was going on that stage, and it was going, I know which path to walk down, and it's the exit sign over there.
It did get them back on a sort of track in a Heaven and Hell Mob Rules style. And The Shining and The Scarlet Pimpernel on this record are very good songs. In fact, Eternal Idol has stacked up quite decently over the years. It's quite a respectable album, but it's not a Black Sabbath album. Like Seven Star, it didn't get the respect it deserved because it was put out under the wrong handle, as it were, under the wrong name. If it had been another Iommi solo album, I think people would have actually started to take notice of what was going on, but oh no, came out as Black Sabbath and effectively buried it because no one really cared anymore.
Headless Cross saw veteran drummer Cozy Powell and bassist Lawrence Cottle joining Iommi and Martin. It marked a slight upturn in Sabbath's fortunes in the UK.
I think critics were almost giving up on Black Sabbath at this point because they've gone through so many changes of direction and changes of singer reaching the point of almost of no return. Really.
But they were so convinced that this was going to be the new Sabbath, this was going to, you know, and they were filling Hammersmith Odeon at the time, so I guess in a way they were right. But it just seemed like jobbing musicians. I think there was only Tony Iommi left in the band from the original lineup, and it was almost like a karaoke band trying to earn some money.
Headless Cross, and people may not agree with me, I think it's the best Black Sabbath album after Heaven and Hell. I think it's even better than Mob Rules. I think it's a magnificent record. It was a record where it all came together and gelled for a new era, right at the end of the 1980s. Great musically, great songs, it gelled, it worked. It was a wonderful album. It was as if, because things had gone so wrong for so long, there was no pressure anymore, and they wrote this magnificent album, just full of wonderful tunes.
Shortly after the release of Headless Cross, Cottle was replaced by bassist Neil Murray, and with Jeff Nichols back on keyboards, this lineup made the Tear album in 1990.
Do you see how all the perfect grace? Does it make you laugh? Put a smile on your face.
Tear was the album which followed Headless Cross. It's nowhere near as good. It's got a couple of good numbers, Anna Mundi and Sabbath Stones. It's in the same vein, but it's almost as if they put all their emotional and creative energies into this one burst on Headless Cross and had run out, and suddenly went zoom. And it's not a bad album, but it's by no means a Headless Cross. It just suffered by implication and by comparison.
After Tear, the soap opera continued, when Iommi reunited the lineup with Geezer Butler, Ronnie James Dio, and the resulting album, Dehumanizer, saw Sabbath back in the American Top 50 for the first time in 9 years.
Now, after Tear, Tony Martin had run his course, it seemed, and the idea started to be put around about a reunion with Ronnie James Dio. 10 years after the fallout, Ronnie's career as a solo artist with Dio was a bit in the doldrums. He was starting to express feelings that he'd like to work with Iommi especially again. He felt they had one great album left to do and there was unfinished business. And finally they spoke and thought, well, let's get back together, do an album, do a tour. Of course, enormous enthusiasm from everybody. Geezer Butler was back on board as well. This was a classic band getting back together. I feel Dehumanizer was terrible. Dreadful album. Really misguided, didn't have much of the elements that made Heaven and Hell, and to a slightly lesser extent Mob Rules, so popular and so successful and so good. It seemed a bit of a mishmash. It seemed that they didn't quite know how to work together anymore. It was produced by a guy called Mac in Germany, much more known for more of an electronic approach, and I don't think it worked whatsoever. I think it's a very poor album and really doesn't stack up in terms of respect for what they had done before.
Dio left again. And for 94's Cross Purposes, Iommi brought back Tony Martin and added yet another ex-Rainbow man in drummer Bobby Rondinelli.
And our tour manager, Robert Gambino, calls me and he goes, Rondinelli, Sabbath's looking for a drummer. So I says, oh, great. So I said, well, why don't you call up Tony and put in a good word? He goes, I can't, his missus doesn't like me anymore. So he gave me Tony's number. And I called, his wife at the time answered the phone, and I said, hi, my name is blah, 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 and I heard Sabbath's looking for a drummer, you know, could you please give Tony my number? So about 10 minutes later, he called me back, and he goes, well, it's funny you called, because we had your name on a list. It's kind of silly, because they didn't want me to run into Cozy. He was leaving anyway, you know, and I know he knew I was there. It was like wherever he'd go, they'd say, "Oh, go the other way." I mean, it was like I really felt like a dummy, you know what I mean? I wanted to just go up and say, "Hi, how you doing?" You know, but we became friends later.
I'm going to have a go at Tony Martin here. What sort of man is it who, having spent something like 6 years with a band, as he had done with Sabbath, is cast away because Ronnie Dio is coming back, and then when the Dio tour and album finishes, meekly goes back to the band? What sort of man is it? I'm sorry, but no self-respect. So I don't blame Sabbath. I'm just amazed Tony Martin did it. Now, if he'd put his heart and soul and come up with 2 great albums with them, I could say, well, at least, you know what he did with Sabbath when he came back was so good, he proved a point to them. He didn't. Cross Purposes and Forbidden were the 2 albums, and to be honest, they're very mediocre. With Cross Purposes, Geezer Butler was still there. They brought in Bobby Rondinelli on drums. Dying for Love is quite a good power ballad, but really in the shadow of No Stranger to Love from the 7 Star album. Hand the Rocks the Cradle is okay. The rest of the album, who cared? Forbidden, the one good track is The Illusion of Power, because it has Ice-T on there, which is an interesting move to have, to bring in somebody like that. The rest of it is rubbish. So you had 2 pretty ordinary albums from a singer who never really had established himself and put his stamp on Black Sabbath. And quite honestly, it was a mishmash, and it was a part of Sabbath's career where everyone once again shrugged their shoulders and said, oh well, here we go again.
We took a gamble with the album Forbidden, which is not well known at all. And in terms of the production, it really didn't sound like Sabbath normally would. It was very dry and not particularly heavy sounding. And in retrospect, that was probably a mistake to try and go in that direction and try and sound more like what metal bands were sounding like in the mid-90s. But by the time it's out and you've got the reaction to it, it's too late. You can't go back and redo it. You're stuck with it.
In between all the studio recordings, countless other musicians joined the touring bands, and with Iommi having seemingly exhausted his merry-go-round of musicians, the original lineup once again got back together for a live album recorded in the band's hometown of Birmingham. This reunion also produced a couple of new studio tracks.
Well, after all was said and done, and all the rows and all the arguments, I don't think anybody believed Ozzy would ever actually go back to performing with Black Sabbath. Why he felt the need to go back to work with Sabbath again, I don't know, but maybe it was financial reasons, maybe it was to help out the other guys, who knows why they got back together.
Ozzy by that point was bigger than Black Sabbath had ever been. He'd outstripped his old band easily. He had the Ozfest happening in America. He had everything going his way. And I think there was also a feeling of, we ended it very badly in the 70s. Let's see if we can get back together. Let's see what happens. Let's see if the magic's still there. Well, it was.
At last, Sabbath delivered the live album that they should have delivered whilst they were still Sabbath with Ozzy, rather than doing it with Dio. And yeah, I mean, Birmingham NEC, 2 nights of complete magic. Even Ozzy's gone on record saying that, you know, and I remember talking to Bill as well, it was just like, everything about it was just magic, perfect. And they knew they'd nailed it, they knew they'd done it, they knew they'd given a great one of the best performances in years and years and years, and it had been captured on vinyl.
Since then, the classic Sabbath has been an on-off project and continues to remind rock fans around the world of just how influential those 4 lads from Birmingham were in shaping heavy rock music over the past 35 years.